Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law. And for today's story, we turn our attention to a decision recently from the Maine Human Rights Commission, which is apparently a thing that exists, which says that it is not a human rights violation to say that men and women exist and that they're different. This apparently is still acceptable speech somehow, because we had to have a decision on this issue about whether or not it's okay to say there are men and there are women and there are differences between men and women. And maybe these are categories that exist, and we had to have a decision on it. So we're going to review that decision today. We turn our attention to the decision from the Maine Human Rights Commission from August of last year in the case of Elizabeth Leiberger versus the University of Southern Maine. Great. Let's read this case. The complainant, who was a graduate student, alleged that the respondents, the university and a professor, discriminated against them being their preferred pronoun, based on sexual orientation or gender identity when Professor Christy Hammer stated there were only two biological sexes. And the University of Southern Maine did not take sufficient action to correct the professor's misconduct. So just in case there was any confusion here, the misconduct is the professor, or the alleged misconduct is the professor saying there are only two biological sexes. That is the hate speech, and that is the human rights violation, according to Elizabeth Leiberger. Professor Christy Hammer had the temerity to say that there are men and women, and that exhausts the categories. Great. The respondent denied discrimination, arguing the professor could not be individually liable, and even if she could, her conduct did not rise to the level of harassment. Respondent also argued the university took appropriate action in response to the complaint. The investigator conducted a preliminary investigation which included reviewing documents submitted by the party, an issues and resolutions conference, and requests for information. Based on this information, the investigator recommends finding that there are no reasonable grounds to believe the respondents discriminated against complainant based on gender identity. Fun. All right. So they had a conference and an investigation. They had an investigation to determine whether or not it's okay to say that there are men and women, and that's all there are. Those are all the things that there are. Whether or not that's okay to say. All right, so let's read a little bit more about the fact pattern, because that was just the summary of the case. Here is a little bit more about the fact pattern. The complainant is non-binary and transgender, which, you could have kind of figured that out, and is a graduate student working on obtaining their teaching certification at the university. In fall of 2022, they took a class that was taught by the professor entitled Creating a Positive Learning Environment. So they're a non-binary transgender, would like to be a teacher, and they're taking a class at the university on how to create a positive learning environment. Fun. On September the 14th of 2022, the complainant asked the professor, how many biological sexes are there? And the professor responded, 2. That is the hate speech. That is the discrimination on the basis of sex. That is the discrimination. That is the wrong thing. She's a graduate level student at the university. She'd like to teach, and she asks the professor, how many sexes are there? And the professor says 2. Now we have to have an investigation over that. It's very super exciting. Okay, great. The complainant found the professor's comments to be offensive, became upset, and left the classroom. Several of the complainant's classmates also walked out of class in solidarity with them. Again, them here is a person, one person. We're using them as a pronoun. Shortly thereafter, complainant and their classmates drafted a letter to the university requesting the facilitation of a restorative justice circle. Again, this is a thing that actually happened. This is not a parody. This is a thing that's actually happening. They want a restorative justice circle to address the professor's problematic comments, the problematic comment being that there are two sexes. Respondent organized a restorative justice circle in response to the complainant. Complainant and their classmates had hoped the professor would apologize, learn from her mistake, and move on. However, professors showed no remorse over her conduct and repeatedly misgendered claimants, apparently by saying there are two genders. Consequently, complainant classmates decided to demand a new professor for the class. University responded to students' demand by keeping professor's class open while adding a new section with a different professor for those students who wanted to transfer. We are coddling the graduate students because of the wrong thing. Holy shit. The university told the professor not to contact students about the class about transferring. However, on September the 30th of 2022, professor sent an inflammatory and divisive email that pressured students to remain in her class. Professor's statements in class on September 14th, her misgendering of complainant at the Restorative Justice Circle, and her inflammatory email of September the 30th were examples of discrimination against the complainant based on gender identity, and the university did not take sufficient action to correct the misconduct and ensure the professor did not engage in similar behavior. That's what the complainant had to say about it. That's what the complainant had to say about what happened to them, which right away, I want to punch complainant in the face. Right? It's like, it's one of those things where it's bad when you're ready to rule for the other side based on their own complaint. And we've certainly seen that in legal filings too. It doesn't happen that often. We've seen legal filings that are weak. We've seen legal filings we don't agree with. We've seen legal filings that have problems. But every once in a while, it doesn't happen that often, but every once in a while, you see a complaint from someone and you're like, I am 100% ready to rule against you. I don't need to know more things. I know all the things I need to know. You have no case. You never had a case. Please shut down and shut up. Right? It does happen. And this is one of those cases because this is their story. This is their telling of the story. And they can't deal with being told that men and women are different and those are all there are. There are no more things beyond men and women. And that is what we want to complain about. I'm like, yeah, I don't really need to know more things. I'm good. But let's learn some more things anyway. Here's what the respondent had to say about this horrible, horrible hate speech. In fall of 2022-2023 academic year, the complainant took professors' graduate level class in the Creating a Positive Learning Environment at the university campus. On September 7th, 2022, as part of the curriculum, professors spoke with her students about the importance of respecting an individual's pronouns. The complainant was not present at that class. At the end of the period, one of the students made a comment that pronouns were a fad, and science had determined there were only two sexes. Hype. Several students immediately objected to students' comments and engaged with him in the conversation. Professors, seeing the class had ended at that point, did not engage in discussion or address students' comments. So the professor said, pronouns are important. And one of the students said, no, I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think it's a fad, and I don't think the science supports it. And then we have a whole fight about it in class. Exciting. The wrong thing will not be tolerated. The following week, on September the 14th of 2022, the complainant did attend class. This is going to be the showdown, right? This is going to be the showdown over the mean students' comments who said, you know what? I'm not really into the pronoun thing. I don't really believe in it. So we're going to have the showdown now. Within minutes of the class commencement, complainant remarked to the professor that they had heard and missed an interesting class the prior week. Complainant then asked professor in a confrontational tone, how many sexes are born? Professor responded, there are two biological sexes plus variations. Complainant then interrupted professor before she could complete her statement and announced, you're not fit to teach this class. Complainant then walked out of the classroom followed by 4 or 5 additional students. The next day, a student who had attended the September 7th class, not the complainant, filed a bias incident report with the university naming professor and student. So we'd also like to get the student who had the wrong thing in trouble for the bias because they don't believe in this stuff. Several students later sent a letter requesting the university set up a restorative justice circle. We literally want to get everyone together in a circle Unclear whether or not drums are involved in the drum circle, but probably. We want to get everyone in a circle and sing Kumbaya. And if they don't sing the right tune, we're going to bludgeon you to death. Outstanding. Okay. The university organized the Restorative Justice Circle, and the professor agreed to participate. I wouldn't, but that's me. Professor also apologized to the class for failing to address students' comments immediately when they were made, and apologized to the complainant personally after the Restorative Justice Circle. So the professor has no balls. The complainant and some other students were not satisfied with the outcome of the Restorative Justice Circle. See, this is why you never apologize. Or more to the point, you don't apologize when you don't think you're wrong. I think you should apologize when you think you're wrong, but I don't think you should apologize because the mob demands it. Because the mob is never satisfied. They're never happy. They're never happy until you say exactly their thing and exactly their way, and until you do, you're just a bigot, don't you know? You know? So this is what they say it happened anyway, right? So like, okay, fine. Complainant and some other students were not satisfied, and per the students' request, the university secured a professor who was on sabbatical. We pulled them out of their vacation, lol, to teach a second section of the course. Both sections of the class continued throughout the remaining of the semester. The investigators make the following findings of fact. The Human Rights Commission would like you to know they find these following things to be true. Here's what the Human Rights Commission finds to be true in their infinite wisdom. Okay. The complainant is non-binary and a transgender graduate level student attending the university. Again, I think it's worthy of note, she's a graduate student. If she were a university student alone, that would be enough for me. I mean, you're a university student, but she's a graduate student and she can't deal with it. Or they can't deal with it, or whatever pronouns they prefer, I guess. On September 7th, 2022, the professor taught a second class of the semester. Complainant was absent. During the lecture, professor talked about the background of pronoun use and how allowing students to identify their pronouns could create an inclusive environment. At the end of the class, a student made a comment about pronouns being a fad. Other students in the class objected and began this discussion with students. Professor believed the students had accurately addressed students' comments themselves and didn't get involved. Sometime between the classes, the complainant received a text message from two fellow students that alerted them to what occurred on September the 7th, a day that will live in infamy, I'm sure. On September the 14th of 2022, when professor did not bring up the issue within a few minutes of class beginning, and I think by a few minutes we mean a few seconds, but whatever, complainant asked professor how many sexes there were. Professor responded, there are two sexes with variation. And then there's a footnote. There's a footnote in the factual findings, which is an interesting choice. There's a factual dispute over how the conversation went. I don't know why you're saying this, incidentally, because you're supposed to be making findings of fact. So why are you referring to dispute? No court would do this. The court would just simply say, here's the facts. Right? If they were making findings of fact, I don't know why we have a footnote now magically, but we magically have a footnote. The footnote says, there's a factual dispute over how the conversation went. Complainant recollected the professor asked the question simply by saying two. And then complainant asked about people who were born intersex and trans, which led to a short discussion in which professor admitted there were variations. Professor, however, stated she was interrupted by complainant when trying to explain there were only two sexes, that there were variations in gender, and that sex and gender are different. Professor described complainant as rude and aggressive. No. What are the odds? No. Yeah. All right, pressing back into the fact pattern. Complainant told professor that she was not fit to teach class and walked out. Several students joined the walkout, and ultimately class was adjourned. On September 16th of 2022, students from professor's class sent an email to the university detailing a walkout that occurred on September the 14th of 2022 in protest of professor's comment that there was only two sexes. The letter requested the university facilitate a restorative justice circle. And right about now, I'm like, let me laugh at you and wait, no, let me laugh harder because you're actually serious. They call it a restorative justice circle. They call it a restorative justice circle. I mean, why not just call it a Maoist struggle session and save time? Why not just call it a malice struggle session and save time? We'll call it a restorative justice circle, though. That should take place on the class of September 28th. The goals of the restorative justice circle the students proposed were listed as the following. Addressing professors' classroom management surrounding the transphobic comments of one student in an incident from September the 7th. So it's transphobic to disagree with the message. Right? The disagreement is the transphobia. That is unsurprising to anyone who has, ever been accused of transphobia. It's like, I disagree with you, therefore it's transphobia. It's like, no, I just think that you're making shit up and I think you're wrong on the facts. That makes you transphobic. It's like, no, I just think you're wrong. I think science says that there are men and women. No, you're a bigot. No, once again, but they just use these labels, racist, transphobic, whatever, because it's a fun thing to do. All right, pressing on. Addressing professors' comments on September the 7th and 14th as transphobic and harmful, to creating an environment conducive to learning, and ensuring professor educates herself on diversity and inclusion, as well as biological facts on gender and sex in order to be qualified to teach a class on positive classroom environments. Yeah, that's the problem. The professor needs education. That's certainly the issue, I'm sure. The letter also stated that students no longer wish to attend professor's section if she was resistant to addressing her implicit bias and demanded placement in a different section. Exciting. On September the 28th of 2022, professor and students attended a restorative justice circle moderated by the university's diversity, equity, and inclusion administrator. How nice, the DEI administrator is there. The RGC lasted approximately 3 hours. 3 hours for their circle time. Professor unintentionally misgendered complainant twice using she and her. And then there's a footnote that says the following. Complainant provided an audio recording of the RGC. Of course she recorded it. Of course she did. Or they did. At approximately 87 minutes and 45 seconds into the recording, professor, while referring to complainant walkout on September 14th, said, complainant after she left. Dun, 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 she said she. Oh my God. Later, at approximately 129 minutes and 50 seconds into the audio recording, professor attempted to address complainant's actions and stated, why was I taken with complainant? Her strategy. A couple of unidentified voices interrupted saying there in order to correct professor. Professor, stuttering a little, corrected herself by saying them, their strategy, and continued with their point. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. So twice in a 3-hour-long discussion, the professor accidentally used the wrong pronoun. Dun, dun, dun. Following the restorative justice circle, DEI met with complainant and other students for a debrief. The students decided they were not satisfied with the results of the restorative justice circle. Amazing. Amazing. The pink-haired liberals are not satisfied with the restorative justice circle. No one could have seen that coming. This is completely unpredictable. No one could have possibly predicted that they'd be unsatisfied with the results of the restorative justice circle. Oh my God, the horror. What are the odds? What are the odds they would not be satisfied? Who could imagine it? They requested the university form a new section of the class taught by a different professor. The university immediately set up a new section, bringing a professor back from their sabbatical. I know you're supposed to have a break, but we've got a crisis on our hands. And allowed all students in the class to choose which section they preferred. 13 students remained in the professor section, and the rest switched. On September 28th, the professor emailed a complainant to apologize. And here apparently is a footnote to that. Complainant stated at the IRC they did not believe the professor's apology was sincere because the professor did not use the words "I'm sorry" and followed the apology with excuses. While it's true the professor used the body of the email to explain herself, she also said, may I please ask you to consider accepting my apology, and I do ask for your forgiveness, and I'm sorry I made you feel unsafe. Lol. Can you imagine like a professor sending this? I know there was an email in the 1950s, but let's ignore that point for the moment. Can you imagine a professor sending this kind of communication in 1950? I'm sorry for this and all the rest. Can you imagine a professor doing this instead of the student just being expelled from the school? I can't. I'm having a real hard time imagining that one. This is great. This is great because it is so stupid. On September the 30th of 2022, professor emailed the class, asking them to email her if they would like to prefer to stay in her section or move to a new one. And then there's a footnote that says, complainant argued the email was a form of harassment. Would you like to stay in my class or would you like to transfer? That apparently was harassment. The email does not read that way to the investigator. Oh, thank God. Complainant also argued the email violated a directive from the dean to refrain from contacting students regarding a section change. Respondent, however, explained the dean had given that direction to the professor in an in-person meeting at 10 a.m., and the email to the class was timestamped at 7:38 that preceded the directive. So 2.5 hours before the dean said, don't email them anymore, she sent an email saying, would you like to transfer or not? That's harassment, man. That's harassment. In violation of a directive she wouldn't receive for 2.5 hours, ma'am. Exciting. She also stated that she believed a head injury she suffered as a child had affected her short-term memory and could be the cause of her struggle in using the student's preferred pronouns. On October 24, 2022, the university issued a no contact order between complainant and the professor. On December 16th of 2029, complainant filed a complaint of misconduct against professor, and the university issued a Title IX investigation. One of the things I really hope for, and I probably won't get, but one of the things I hope for from the new Congress is I hope they amend Title IX to make it clear that, there are men and women and there are biological sexes and there are different, and there are no other things beyond that. And that's, exactly what the law was always talking about because it clearly was. So one of the things I hope is that they'll amend Title IX to stop this bullshit. We'll see if I get my wishes. The university completed its Title IX investigation on February the 27th of 2023. University found that professors' comments in the classroom were not evidence of harassment or discrimination based on gender or gender expression. University also found the creation of a second section did not create a hostile learning environment. Finally, the university found professor had created a hostile learning environment by repeatedly misgendering the complainant. And there's a footnote. The university investigator reasoned professor had created a hostile learning environment not only because she misgendered the complainant at the Restorative Justice Circle, but because she continued to misgender complainants in interviews and emails with the university investigator, even after being reminded not to do so. It does not appear that complainant was present during these discussions. Notably, the university investigator also misgendered complainant during the investigation. No one can keep it straight. No one can keep it straight. Even the people who are in charge with investigating can't keep it straight. Nice. On April the 18th of 2023, the professor appealed the findings of the Title IX investigation. All right. The Maine Human Rights Act requires the Maine Human Rights Commission to determine whether a reasonable grounds to believe unlawful discrimination has occurred. The commission interprets the standard to believe there's at least an even chance of prevailing in a civil action. Okay. I'm not sure if that's the same thing as preponderance or not, and they don't clarify, right? Is me determining whether or not you have an even chance of prevailing in a civil lawsuit the same as me determining whether or not you have preponderance of the evidence? I'm not 100% sure what they think it means. Right? So if I say to you, I think that you have a 60% chance of winning, is that the same thing as me saying you have preponderance of the evidence, or am I just speculating about what will develop throughout time? Yeah, I'm not sure it's necessarily the same thing. So I'm not exactly sure what you have at least an even chance of winning means in terms of legal percentages, but let's press on. All right, let's learn a little bit more about a hostile educational environment at a university. The educational provisions of the Maine Human Rights Act provide a relevant part. It's unlawful to subject a person to discrimination in any program or activity, on the basis of sex, sexual orientation, or gender identity, physical or mental disability, ancestry, national race, religion, race, or color. The Maine Human Rights Act does not explicitly address claims of harassment. And in the employment context, the Maine Human Rights Act, followed by federal law, has been interpreted to include claims involving a hostile environment. Similarly, hostile environment claims have been extended to Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which has similar wording for public accommodation. A postgraduate school is a place of public accommodation. Accordingly, a hostile learning environment claim will be recognized here, and the standards from the employment context will be adopted. Hostile environment claims involve repeated or intense harassment, sufficiently severe or pervasive to create an abusive environment. In determining whether an actionable hostile learning environment claim exists, it's necessary to view all the circumstances, including the frequency of the discrimination context, its severity, whether it's physically threatening or humiliating, or a mere offensive utterance, and whether it unreasonably interferes with the individual enjoyment of educational institution. It's not necessary that inappropriate conduct occur more than once, so long as severe enough to become hostile or abusive. The standard requires both an objective hostile or abusive environment, one a reasonable person would find abusive. I like how they clarify what it means to be objective. That's nice. I mean, any lawyer knows that's what we mean by objective, right? The reasonable man test is exactly what we mean by objective. But, let's, clarify that for the people who don't know. As well as the victim's subjective perception that the environment is abusive. To establish liability on the part of the educational environment for hostile environment created by one of its employees, complainant must demonstrate that the educational institution knew or should have known of the charged unlawful harassment and failed to implement prompt and appropriate action. Complainant initially alleged a hostile educational environment based on a single interaction. There's a footnote. Even considering the use of female gender pronouns during the restorative justice circle, complainant has not established severe or pervasive harassment. Professor used gendered pronouns twice in the course of a tense 3-hour meeting. This is not to excuse professor's use of these pronouns, only to say, considering all the circumstances that his new law requires, the totality of the record does not support finding of a hostile educational environment. Fun times. Fun times. Thank you very much for the super chats. I do appreciate it. And thank you for wishing me a happy birthday. That's very, very kind of you. I'm an old. Complainant initially alleged a hostile educational environment based on a single interaction they had with professor. Complainant was dissatisfied with what they told about professor's handling of student conduct during a prior class. Yeah, at which they were not present. Complainant went in, it's nice when you can be offended when you weren't even there. That is a nice touch. Professor commented it was not sufficiently severe to create a hostile environment, nor was any basis established for holding university liable for the situation. Yeah, if simply saying that there are men and women is a hostile environment, man, I don't know, man, yeah. Thank you, Tilly T, for the memberships in the past. We do appreciate them, and thank you for your continued support. Sometimes I don't always see it, but I do appreciate it every time. It's very helpful. Thank you. Sometimes I'm enraptured in what I'm doing. Complainant initially alleged a hostile environment based on a single interaction they had with professor. Complainant was dissatisfied with what they were told about professor's handling of student conduct during a prior comment in which they were not present. Complainant went into class wanting to address the issue and asked professor how many sexes there were. Immediately, professor started to answer intending to say 2 with variations. Complainant told her she was unfit to teach and walked out, preventing any further discussion on the matter. Considering all circumstances, professor's comment was not sufficiently severe to create a hostile environment, and then apparently there's a discussion on that point. That footnote says, much of the conflict appears to occur because professor was attempting to distinguish between biological sex as determined by the presence of X and or Y chromosomes and gender. Professor was not able to elaborate on their answer as the situation unfolded. Considering all the circumstances, professor's comment was not sufficiently severe to create a hostile environment, nor was any basis established for holding university liable for the situation. The university took prompt, appropriate action in response to complainant's complaint against professor by facilitating a restorative justice circle requested by complainant and other students, and by allowing the student to transfer into a second section of the class without penalty, also requested by the complainant and other students. The university took these actions almost immediately after they were requested. In addition, the university investigated complainant's actions of discrimination after complainant submitted their Title IX complaint. Discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity has not been found. Oh, thank God. The Maine Human Rights Act provides it's unlawful for any person to coerce, intimidate, threaten, or interfere with an individual in exercise or enjoyment of the rights granted or protected by this act. The rights granted by the act include the right to be free from discrimination in education on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. Therefore, if a respondent continues to deny complaint the right to be free from discrimination in an educational institution, respondent may be liable for interference. The Commission interprets the section's interference to require some individual discriminatory action. For example, it's not enough for a supervisor to enforce work rules. Rather, the supervisor must themselves engage in discriminatory actions outside of their usual responsibility. Here, professors' actions do not rise to the level of interference. Professors' September the 14th, 2022 statement saying there are two statements with variations is not objectively offensive. Well, I'm sure that the blue-haired, pink-haired contingent will be surprised to learn this information. It is not objectively offensive, meaning a reasonable person cannot find it offensive, which means implicitly you're not a reasonable person. Right? If a reasonable person can't find it offensive, it must mean you're not a reasonable person. Which, I think we all kind of knew that, but it's nice to say it out loud. Nor is there evidence of discrimination and animus against complainant. There's no evidence in the record the professor bore any hostile intent when responding to complainant's question about the number of biological sexes, nor is there any evidence professor treated complainant differently than other students based on complainant's gender identity. Professor's actions became more problematic when she misgendered complainant at the RJC, the Restorative Justice Circle, which once again, I can't believe they really call it that. That's kind of hilarious. Notwithstanding, professor's actions still did not rise to the level of interference because referring to complainant as she and her in mid-sentence and 40 minutes apart appeared to be mistaken rather than intentional misgendering. These errors cannot reasonably be construed as coercion, intimidation, or a threat to interfere with complainant's right to be free from discrimination. Therefore, interference is not found. For the reasons stated above, it's recommended the Maine Human Rights Commission issue the following finding. There are no reasonable grounds to believe the University of Southern Maine discriminated against Elizabeth Lieberger on the basis of gender identity. There are no reasonable grounds to believe that Christy Hammer interfered with Elizabeth Lieberger's right to be free from discrimination based on gender identity, and the complaint should be therefore dismissed. And then there's some further footnotes, which I suppose we will read. Footnote 9. Discussions of gender and biological sex are understandably sensitive, especially in the current political climate. Lol. Nevertheless, educational institutions must, if they are to maintain any semblance of intellectual integrity, that'd be nice, be capable of having nuanced conversations about controversial and sensitive topics. Here, complainant initiated the discussion about sex by asking professor how many biological sexes there were. And she became upset when they became upset rather, because we're using their pronouns, I guess. And they, the singular they, became upset when they did not receive the answer they were looking for. Professor's opinion, in which she argued was based on her own understanding of scientific literature and differences between sex and gender, is not evidence of discrimination. On the contrary, a professor taught about the importance of pronoun use in the creative, a positive learning environment in the previous class. It's certainly logical to argue professor should have been more conscientious of her language under the circumstances, but it's also comprehensible that professor may have been flustered under the Restorative Justice Circle's public scrutiny. Professor misgendering complained twice in a 3-hour discussion and correcting herself immediately after a student identified the faux pas. Exciting. Well, that's super exciting. So this all happened at the University of Southern Maine, which would prefer to be known formally as the University of Maine system, but they didn't correct the record in time. So the University of Southern Maine. Yeah, wherein Elizabeth Lieberger is a transgender non-binary, according to the findings, who thinks that Professor Christy Hammer is very, very bad for expressing the wrong thing. So, was the class name provided? Yes, it was. The class name was called, we mentioned it before. It was called Creating a Positive Learning Environment. That's the name of the class. Creating a Positive Learning Environment. How exciting. So, yeah. So that is the end of the story. That is the end of the story. Yeah. And but the professor still had to go to the restorative justice circle and still had to issue an apology and still had to do everything else because of the wrong thing. Yes. Transgender but non-binary. That is one of the findings of fact. It is right here. It is right here. Hold on. Yes. Here it is. Yeah. It says, there it is. Complainant is non-binary and transgender. There it is. Yeah. Both non-binary and transgender. It's right in the findings of fact. Don't you know, you bigot. This is a fact. This is a fact. So, yeah, you know, you better get on board with that. You better get on board because that is a fact. So exciting. So, my friends, I guess that won my stream, and yes, it is my birthday. I feel old. I feel old. And some of the people in chat might be saying you are old, which, you know, fair enough, but you know, that's what's happening. Can you non-binary and trans at the same time? Apparently, yes, you can. Apparently, you can non-binary and trans at the same time. How old am I? Oh, Lord. How old do you? Too old. Too old. Yeah, I mean, if you're transgender, doesn't that rule out being non-binary? It's like, yeah, what are you transing from and to? I guess you're transing from one of the non-binaries to one of the other non-binaries. In which case, everyone's arguably trans, I guess, because there's how many of them at these times? Like 70, and like it changes on a global basis. So maybe we're all trans. Maybe we're all trans. Maybe that's what's going on. Thank you very much for the slice of birthday cake with purple icing and candle. That's very nice. You're 43. Your kids say you're old. See, that's one of the problems is I don't have kids. And I feel like I'm getting kind of old to start having a family. And I feel like it's never going to happen. And that's very sad. It's incredibly sad. But I don't want to dwell on that because if I dwell on that, I'm going to wind up in a very negative headspace very fast. So let's move on. Kurt somehow gets better with age. Well, hopefully we all do at some level. Hopefully we'll all get better with age at some level. I'm never too old to have a child. It becomes increasingly problematic to find a woman young enough who is willing to have a child with me the older I become. Or at least that's what I've been told. Because every time I say my dating preferences, for example, because we've had this conversation multiple times, and people say, well, what are you looking for? And I say, for example, well, I'm looking ideally for someone who doesn't have kids and would like to have biological children. So I'd really like to find a woman who's 35 or under. And that's what I say. And people are like, well, that's unrealistic. You can't get that. You're too old for that. That's, you know, not going to happen, and so forth and so on. So like, I'm only telling you what the chat has told me repeatedly. It's like, I'm telling you, they've told me repeatedly, like, You're too old. You can't do that. You can't find a woman who would want that. That's not possible, and so forth and so on. It's like, you're going to be 10 years older than her. No one would want to be with you. So it's like, I've heard this from the chat multiple times. So, I'm just telling you what they've told me. Why 35? I had my son at 37. Well, if she's already 35, by the time we get married and have kids, plus certain biological realities happen to women as they get older. Do I really have to explain this? We just had a whole stream about do I really have to explain and justify my choices? Are we in that stream now? Is that what we're doing? And I'm just have to explain it. I have to explain and justify biological realities as women with age, and I have to explain how women as they age, their incidence of birth defects increase, and it becomes increasingly difficult to conceive, and those conceptions tend to wind up in more rates of birth defects, including do I really have to fucking explain this when we just had a discussion on biology? Plus, you can adopt or surrogate. Okay, then in that case, you're not fucking paying attention. That's not what I want. So as I was saying, I'm feeling a little bit old because I'm feeling that's a little bit difficult for me to obtain at this age. Thank you. I hope that's true. In any event, I'm going to go sign off and continue to feel old. We'll probably be on with some more streaming later and whatever, and we'll hang out some more and we'll go from there. I've been Uncivil Law. Until later, my friends, I hope all is well for now. Cheers, my friends.